Okay, let's continue with Hebrew unity and the consolidation of a real Hebrew kingdom. Then we'll move on to the Assyrian kingdom and the Persian kingdom. This chapter has huge amounts of history in it. And something interesting, I was reading what the author of the book said, and she said a lot of people who teach Western Civ are moving right on to start with the Greeks, Aristotle, etc. But she doesn't do that for a good reason, I believe, and that is because she shows that the history of Western civilization is actually rooted in diversity, in many different kinds of people, not just old white people like who we think the Greeks are and who much of the criticism about teaching Western Civ is. Egyptians, of course, tend to be darker. The Hebrews are not old white people. The Nubians, of course, are African. So we have a lot of different kinds of people who lay at the center of Western civilization. I think that's a very interesting point she makes. Okay, to continue. We left off where the Hebrew civilization were made up of these 12 tribes, two in the north, I'm sorry, two in the south, and 10 in the north in Israel, the kingdom of Israel. You've seen the map on page 59. When the Hebrew tribes existed, they weren't very organized, even in working together. Remember, I said that they often fought over cattle, etc. But they did have a commitment that said if one was um, attacked, all the others would help them. Although they weren't very experienced in how to do that. But in approximately 1050 BCE, when the Levantine coast was settled by the Philistines, they began to sense they had a new enemy, at least according to them. And they began to try to work together. One of the judges, the head of one of these tribes, his name was Samuel, selected a king to lead the kingdom of Israel and Judah into war against the Philistines because they were being attacked frequently. Marauders were stealing their property, etc. He chose somebody named Saul, who you've probably heard of. Saul did not prove to be a very effective war leader. He did block the Philistine penetration into what they called the Hill Company at the time. But he just couldn't get the Philistines out of the coast and the plains right next to the coast. So Samuel, the judge, withdrew his support from Saul and chose as a new military leader Saul's son in law, whose name is David. All of this you probably heard of from your Sunday school classes or what have you, but let's try to figure out who exactly these personalities were. David was from Judah, the south of the Israel, of the Hebrew community, and he wasn't exactly motivated in trying to unify all of Hebrew culture. He was rather ambitious, but he was an unbelievable warrior. He waged independent campaigns in which he won one battle after another over the Philistines. And then, interestingly enough, because Saul was so jealous, he ran his son in law, David, out of town. We don't know all the gory details of his daughter and her relationship with David. Somebody's going to write an interesting movie or soap opera someday. But Saul was not having it, so he ran his daughter's husband out of town. And the reason I say he was ambitious and not necessarily all that patriotic is he went to fight as a mercenary for the Philistines, which of course they loved because he was such a good soldier for hire. And in fact, it was in one of these battles where David was fighting for the Philistines that he killed Saul. Once he killed Saul, David was able to attach himself, of course, to um, once he was able to attach himself again to the kingdom of Judah and do the work of Samuel for the Hebrew kingdom. In fact, not too long after he captured Saul, I don't know what that was, approximately what, 1020, something like that, 1025, that David set himself up as the king, the first to rule over all the tribes of Judah, which were too many, remember, there were only two, but that was his home territory. And later he's going to become ruler over the territory of Israel as well. Once that happens, of course, he's going to try to consolidate that Hebrew kingdom. So David makes this victory and consolidation approximately 1000 BCE, and he takes advantage of Egypt's movement away from the coast, as I said, their decline. And he's going to succeed in confining the Philistines to a pretty inconsequential part of the coastal land. David is also going to defeat the Moabites, who you can see in the Bible, the Ammonites, and he extended his control all the way to the Dead Sea. By the time David dies in 973 BCE, he had a kingdom that stretched from the middle of the Euphrates River in the north to the Gulf of Aqaba in the south, and from the Mediterranean coast east all the way to the Syrian deserts. So Israel then, of which it was called then, the home of these Hebrews, was now a kingdom to be reckoned with. That it was a kingdom that even that even Egypt and Assyria had to reckon with. Now, as David's power and his prestige grew, he imposed a system of taxation and forced labor on all the people of the Hebrew kingdom. Needless to say, that didn't make him very popular amongst his own people. His goal was to build a capital at Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem would be a Canaanite settlement, and it would be the central city in his, realm of governance. It was very smart because if you look at your map, you'll see that it's right between the kingdoms of Israel and the kingdoms of Judah. And what he did was he had conquered the city. It didn't have any affiliation with either the north or the south. He was going to make it the capital city, and he took time to establish it as also a religious center, putting a system of a group of priests in charge of the Holy Ark, which was the symbol of the Hebrew God and the priesthood of the Hebrew God. And his, Hebrew leader, or the leader of his religious choice, was called Yahweh, which is where, of course, we get the term Jehovah. The Hebrews say Yud He Vav He, so they don't have to actually say Yahweh. But he sought to forge a new unified identity centered on family and on his own connections in southern Judah to Yahweh. And he encouraged also in Jerusalem at that time the writing of histories that would talk about his own journey, his identity, his role in it, and the unification of the area. Now, Solomon dies in, David dies, as I said, in 973 BCE. And his son, Solomon, who Solomon, decided to continue his father's policies. He was even had a bigger vision, if you will, and he built an elaborate temple complex in Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant. You know, that thing that the Jews, or the Hebrews, excuse me, they're not Jews yet, believed that Moses got from God on Mount Sinai. So he got support from the Yahweh cult in Jerusalem. It was approved by those people writing the history. And of course, it's included in the Bible. This period in the Bible is often thought of as the Rule of Solomon, that is, as the Golden Age. Even though he's quite ruthless and brutal, this period becomes known as the Golden Age of the Hebrew kingdom. He was brutal, Solomon. He, according to his own Solomon's own records and writings, he had a harem of 300 wives, 700 concubines. I guess he had an insecurity complex about his role as a man. But at any rate, many of them were subjects, many of them were people that they conquered. He lived in this palace complex. It was like a complex like the old Sargons and Mesopotamian potentates. And in order to finance his expensive tastes and programs, he initiated more taxation. He imposed customs duties on all trade that passed through the country. He constructed a trading fleet of ships on the waters of the Red Sea and beyond. He traded gold and silver that he mined by many slaves. And so this new wealth, of course, came at a high price. He conscripted many of his people into a large, unwilling army. It had chariots, cavalry squads, horses. Everything was purchased abroad. And he required many of his subjects to perform forced labor for at least 4 months out of every year. Now, many of the Israelites, and especially the northern tribes, were just so enraged against Jerusalem and Solomon's leadership and exploitation. Remember, not so many in the south. First of all, there's only 2 tribes in the south, and one of them is David's, and so they didn't rebel quite as much. So within a decade of Solomon dying, approximately 937 BCE, this monarchy and united kingdom, north and south, that David and Solomon created, had split in 2. The dynasty of David continued to rule the south, and the kingdom of the north in Israel just took their capital away from Jerusalem. It was like a split off in the community. Took their capital, needless to say, they were the larger ones, and they made their capital not in Jerusalem, but in a place called Shechem, which is today Nablus, which is in the news all the time. Now we have archaeology, the historical accounts of the Bible, the cult of Yahweh, and it's interesting because the cult of Yahweh and the priesthood that was in Jerusalem were neither that popular in the north nor the south. Kind of interesting in enough. So they made, that would make them coming together again or any religious sort of reunification really hard to achieve. In the meantime, the Hebrew kingdom, as they're split apart, no longer unified, really not united any longer, even on a religious sense, became more and more vulnerable to those outside territories and nations like the Assyrian Empire, which is going to be built up again and even the Egyptian one. Okay, I'll stop here. The rest of the chapter is Assyria, Persia, and because Persia has something called Zoroastrianism, which is a kind of monotheism, and the Hebrews are going to not exactly invent, but popularize the belief in one God, which is monotheism. That's where we end this chapter before we go on to the Greeks. So I guess I have like one more lecture, maybe two, in me here. Okay, thank you.